Hey guys, welcome back to reading Deviations of Defiance, my second book, out on Amazon. You can find it in the link in the description. We are on Chapter 4, Short Love. Hans Ardevart slept for what seemed like an eternity. His back was so unused to a bed that the comfort even affected his dreams. He dreamed about how he met Archibald. It was a momentous occasion for him. The best decision in his life was over. Now he could have children and grandchildren, and die knowing that everything would be left to his generations on end. She was another halfling in the capital city of Ostanovka, a halfling who just so happened to sell exotic perfumes in the stall that was situated right next to his original one in the market. He had fallen in love fast, unlike his uncle, who had taken his time to woo that woman in the village. Hans would never understand why the man had fallen for a human. She had lovely green eyes, this Archibalda, and very buxom. That's what he liked the most about her. Plus, she understood his jokes well enough, and having company while they both worked was nice. Hans started sneaking her kisses whenever no one was looking. Gentle, kind ones at first. He quickly changed that. You give an inch and they take a mile. That's exactly what Hans did. As soon as he was able, he slid right under her bed sheets where they were both very comfortable. Every night in the city, they went after each other like wild animals. It was soon that they were married in a small ceremony with only a few people there. Archibalda didn't even want that. She wanted just her and him so it would be as intimate as possible. The older generation always whined about married life, how awful it was, how you have no more freedom, especially if you are a man. Hans refused to believe this, even when his wife echoed the same talking points as all the others. Manreft was able to send the two on a sort of honeymoon several months later. Not anything big, but it was enough to suffice. A time away from their apartment in the crowded capital city to the wooded forests of the mountainside. They went to a nice little cabin that Manreft owned out there, in addition to his own house in the city. No matter how many ducats Hans made, Manreft always seemed to walk away with shekels in his pockets. That was probably because he did the business side of things. It was a nice couple of weeks away from the hustle and bustle of the market. Hans would often say to Archibalda, "My sweet love, how much I am grateful for having laid eyes on you. The one hobbit in 1,000 who would find one such as me so desirable to become your husband." Archibalda would reply in turn, "Nay, it is I who should be grateful for being your wife. I was the lowly market wench before the world to everyone except for you, and you loved me in turn. Come, let us make babies, and lots of them." Hans, bereft of breath, would then reply back to her, "Oh, take me, Archibalda." What did they really have besides this purely animalistic attraction so far? Well, they were in and of themselves being animals as halflings, and should not be expected to act in such a way, but otherwise not too much. The pair started making babies there and then, and life kept them busy. Kept Hans busy, at least, while Archibalda was plopping out one child after another, in order to please her man. What did they talk about when they were together? Just the two of them. No one else involved, and no children to keep them occupied as of yet. Often these conversations would go as such at dinner, when they finally had a moment of peace and quiet together. "How was your day, Archibalda?" Hans would say. "It was all right. I didn't do much. Just some cooking and cleaning as usual." "How was yours, honey?" Archibalda would answer. "Busy as always. You know how the market is these days. Just terrible. I've been hearing some rumors of frightful beasts in the wilderness over in the Dragonbacks. They're saying they might start to put out contracts for anyone to go and kill them for a reward." "Oh, how awful!" Archibald replied. "I'm glad to be behind these walls. Can you imagine if anything got in? How frightened I'd be." "Ah, don't worry your cute little self about such things," Hans replied. "Nothing can get past these walls. King Kolovob made sure of that. Such a good king he is, gracious and fair. Handsome too, if you don't mind me saying, husband." "No, I want you to speak only the truth, Archibalda, and you are doing just that. He is the most handsome man in all the land. May King Kolovob reign 1,000 years and more." And that's how most of their nights went before it became a real slog to have conversations. They quickly ran out of love for each other once Hans had stopped taking Archibalda every night. Sometimes weeks went by, and they hardly said a word to one another besides a seldom "Thank you," and "You're welcome." You know how it is. They knew each other so fully that there was no more knowledge to be gained out of the other. The only thing that brought novelty to their quickening, miserable state was the world around them. Something new would happen as time went on, and they repeated that conversation. Not much variety in this stale diet. Where they had been so energetic together, they now spent their time together but spiritually away from each other. They even got a dog and argued constantly over it as they were learning to build a family upon this soft sandstone of a foundation. That's why having a child was such a blessing from Gorgonus. It provided them with new challenges to overcome. Overcome might have been too strong a word. Archibalda would get extremely frustrated at any small inconvenience, or any misstep Hans would make. That tendency in her was there since the beginning of their relationship, but it had never been in such stark focus until now. They were often stupid mistakes, or thoughtless errors, that Hans would make, but that didn't matter. In her own ill-fated way, she made Hans feel more and more incompetent every day. Every night, Hans would go over in his head the women that he could have stopped at, but didn't. And so he asked himself every night the same question: why? None of that mattered once she started producing his children. It gave them a whole new entity to deliver their love and devotion to. There was just something so wonderful about having another being to be responsible for. Another halfling in this world who would go on to make his parents proud. Hans felt that he had waited for his whole life for this. Archibalda felt that her days of being a wild-haired, fiery hobbit were gone from her. The woman saw everything through a narrow and pessimistic view. Hans could understand perfectly well where this came from. The hobbits had always been an oppressed minority in Remarden. The dwarves were a minority too, but they were the oppressors. Those damned dwarves. They were jealous of halfling ingenuity in the arts and the merchant houses. At least they hadn't slaughtered wholesale the halflings and the other races who they ruled over, unlike those damned elves. Hans took more of a glass-half-full approach. They were alive and thriving. It was the start of this long and successful career as a major chef. Already they had purchased an apartment, and he was planning to open a full-fledged restaurant. His time with Archibalda was the main hazard in his life. She was pessimistic, and blamed him for everything. Everything that didn't go accordingly, that is. How long would Hans take it? He asked himself that every night, also, when he allowed his thoughts to run around his head. What else could he do? The man had made a promise, and he would fulfill it. There was no backing out of it in the eyes of Gorgonus. No escape except for infidelity. And he refused to even contemplate this part. No, they were in love, and it was his duty to love her no matter what. What did Archibalda think of this? She couldn't care less for Groganus. She put up a good face when Hans had asked all of these religious rites, but it was hard for her to conceal the hatred of it all. Groganus had seemingly abandoned her when she needed him the most. Although Groganus did send her Hans, this fact was nothing more than a coincidence to her. And to Hans, it was divine will. Hans had known that Archibalda didn't particularly care for his god at the beginning. He even had the gut feeling to make her recite the tenets of Groganus before they had been wed. Hans brushed that feeling aside when he should have embraced it. It was the late nights of conversation about just this topic which would dull Hans's fire for her. Another thing was that she always expected the worst out of him, and treated him like he was an idiot all the time. Children were one thing the man was holding out for, and she had refused at the beginning. Luckily, they wound up having several. Archibalda didn't even know what to say, and so she kept silent when around the hobbit. Just the two of them was never a mixture for good. The kids were there to be a loving barrier as they crowned their affection on the children. However, Howard was the first one to come out. He was strong and handsome for a halfling. The boy was shaping out to be like his father in almost every way. And that's why Archibalda grew to hate him. Just looking at her almost certainly unwanted son made the woman despise the situation she had created for herself. They were both proud, so that's one thing she had bestowed on her son. Now the next one to come out was Vladislava. This time it was Hans's turn to despise his own child. Vladislava was just like her mother in every way, like Howard was to his father. The girl was stuck up, too proud for her own good. She enjoyed the luxuries of life, and so overate even snacking at midnight. Vladislava was beautiful in her own right, though. There were none to compare her to except for Archibalda. Lastly, she was extremely smart like her mother. They both always had a knack for puzzles, and especially numbers. Hans couldn't even compete in this area. The third that Archibalda birthed was Kirkul. He was an angel, but probably because he was a simpleton. Archibalda wanted to throw him in the river on multiple occasions. She swore that it was a joke, but Hans was never entirely sure about that. Hans probably loved Kirkul the most, since he could do no wrong intentionally, and he was the most childlike, the most divine. It seemed like it would stop with those three children. Archibalda couldn't stand taking care of them as it was. Before, she had just to take care of Hans while he went off to cook. But now there were 3 extra people to look after, who weren't even contributing to the family coffers. Then, 2 more little halflings popped out of her in quick succession. Those 2 were obnoxious little brats. Hans didn't even know how they went wrong raising them. They were Elon and Homerith. The 2 were always getting into trouble, for no exact reason. They'd throw rocks at their neighbors' houses from the windows and laugh as they retreated back into their own. Of course, they had upgraded to a house in all this time. The family really needed the space with all 5 of them together. By that time, Hans's restaurant was really taking off too. In this way, it was all lining up for the hobbit. He had 5 children whom he loved, and a wife. What more could he ask for? The thing that struck Hans at this point in his career was that he had achieved everything. All that remained was to wait for death. Thoughts such as this floated through his head and confronted him every time he confronted the doublethink around his wife. Hans loved her as well, of course. Don't get me wrong. Just, he had to, is all. They had a family now. Hans had a thriving business, so all he had left was to raise his children. That was, until his career became in jeopardy. Normally it was a party to cater somewhere else every day. The grogmen were usually his best customers. They always enjoyed the fact that a hobbit followed Groganus nearly as much as any other dwarf did. That faction quickly gave way once the Umniki started inviting the famous hobbit chef to their luncheons. They were a cheerful folk, in the governing body of Ramarden. All dwarves, but dwarves who looked to the future. They were jealous at the inventions crafted by those in Capistonia, and they intended to bridge that gap. How they were going to do this was anyone's guess. The average person of Ramarden was the human serf, and they were property. These people had no say in politics, much less innovations in any way. The dwarves kept iron control over this class of people. It was easy for them. Humans were dullards by any measure. The only problem lay in their sheer numbers. That race far outbred the dwarves in order to till the land for their masters. There were probably some extraordinary geniuses in that mass of people, and the Umniki thought it might be worthwhile to lift them up from their lives of servitude and bondage. It was this faction in the Nestrytal which now turned its favor towards the little halfling. But apparently, it wasn't for the better. The common folk held this party in suspicious contempt. The Umniki were reformers, and wanted to change up the order of things, while all of their fathers had owned copious amounts of serfs. And they did too. There was talk that these dwarves wanted to free them. It was unthinkable to do this in society. They were young, and talk was they had plebeian advisors. And those people were always infecting the land with their dangerous talk of equality for all. But now back to our hobbit. There were always attacks on Hans's family and restaurant, because of course they were halflings, but it had never been this bad. Stones were the usual weapon of choice. Those little pieces that didn't wind up thrown at his head normally found their way as huge ones being thrown through the windows of his restaurant. Now those humans had begun throwing them through his own house windows. It was at this precarious moment that Hans's clients started to cancel on him. Archibaldus suggested that it might be his newfound association with this dangerous political faction. Hans dismissed that as wild speculation, but the doubts gnawed at him. Finally, it got so bad that a crowd showed up at the gates of the complex where he lived. They all had torches and clubs. The worst part was that it wasn't a mob made solely out of dwarves. There were humans, dwarves, elves, lizardmen, and even other halflings. He called these last race traders, for they turned against one of their own. Hans didn't wait for the inevitable negotiations that would begin at any moment. He simply told the kids to grab anything of value and for Archibald to do the same. They packed light and quickly made their escape by a side entrance to their complex. Before they left, a rather gruff halfling was shouting at the top of his deep bass voice, "Come out, Hans. We only want you. Your family can stay put, and we won't hurt them. We've had enough of your high-flying ways and fancy foods. We don't want you changing our world with the other Umniki. You've got so much, it's time you share some of that wealth with the rest of us." This halfling had a large scar that ran the length of his nose. It had the effect on an observer of either looking completely ridiculous or making him look like a complete badass. It depended on the context he was presented in. This was a threatening one, and now he looked like a vile beast to be taking from Hans all that halfling had worked for. Hans went with his family to his Uncle Manros's cabin outside the city to lay low for a while. His uncle was incredibly happy to see him alive. Once everyone had calmed down a bit, they could settle for some dinner, It was an expertly cooked mutton pie made by Mika that greeted them. Peas and carrots mixed in with the chunks of sheep and gravy and a savory brown sauce made the family forget about their troubles for now. Manreft had a varying assortment of spices from his trade, which Mika took great advantage of. Hans joined this trade once again, with nothing to go back to in Ostanovka. Archibalda and Mika got along well since Mika had no children of her own as of yet. She treated the art of art kids as her own. Years went by in this spice trade. It went well for Hans, too, because he had the gift of gab. Then one day it all changed as he went to go to a little town called Atrodnaye. Hans broke out of his musings as his wife woke him up from his shocked fatigue. The first thing after her that Hans saw was this scarred halfling holding his wife behind her, and he could not contain his anger. And that is the end to Chapter 4, Short Love, of my second book, Deviations of Defiance. So I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like, subscribe, and of course share it to your friends. That's really how I get off the ground. But thank you for listening to it also. I'll see you guys next time.